Imagine you're wandering at night in the dark and find yourself lost. Then all of a sudden, a light flickers in the distance. What do? Naturally, you may believe this is your chance to find your way back, but as you get closer, you sink into the mud and find yourself deep in a marsh, and around you hovers what you believed was your hope, but is the ghostly orb of the Will O Wisp.
Now, when we talk about the Will O Wisp, there's actually many regional variations of the Will O Wisp across the globe. In British and Irish folklore, it's believed that the Will O Wisp is a spirit that is stuck in almost a purgatory state between heaven and hell for a misdeed that it did in its life, and that actually the light source that it gives out when it's travelling around the marshes is a coal that it was given by the devil to stay aflame and to keep it warm whilst it travels the marshes for eternity. In other variations of the English folklore, the Will O Wisp can be an evil fairy that is tricking people. And a third variation that comes from the British Isles is that the Will O Wisp is actually doing this under the instruction of the devil and is doing evil acts by luring people into the marshes and the swamps on behalf of the devil himself. Now, despite the evil stories that I was talking about, there are some stories where the Will O Wisp is actually a good entity. For example, in the story of Dracula, there is a description of blue flames that supposedly hide hidden treasure. And it's believed that in this story, these blue flames are the Will O Wisps, and like I say, they point to treasure and help people find riches. This folklore can be found globally, but variations in the physical appearance do occur. In Argentina, the Will O Wisp is known as Las Mala, whereas in Japan it is actually known as Hitodama. Now, I think it's important to consider why these stories may have come into fruition. And actually, it seems quite simple, really. Here in Britain, wetlands once dominated the landscape. In fact, London is quite literally built on old sort of marshlands. In fact, in many parts, you can still see some of that evidence of the species that live there, such as adders. And so why would this be important? Well, let's consider when England's at its darkest in the winter. This is also when it's at its coldest. And let's say you're walking around at night and you stroll and get lost within a marshland or a wetland, and perhaps you fall into the water. There's a real risk there of then succumbing to the elements, because you've fallen into cold water, you're covered in mud, you're going to struggle to get warm and dry again. And on top of that, like I say, it could be the depth of winter, and so you will stay cold and you will succumb to the elements. And so then it's no surprise that there's this story of being lured into the marshlands, and that you need to be extra vigilant to not fall prey to the visions that you might have. And so the Will O Wisp can become that cautionary tale of not wandering off the trail in the dark when you are around potential wetland areas. Now, there are some scientific explanations for the Will O Wisp too. It's said that within these boggy marsh conditions, it is possible that what is happening is methane gas is being created from the decay of organic matter. And what happens is, underneath the ground, the methane gas builds up with other gases, and when it mixes and breaks out into the ground, into the oxygen, it ignites, creating this bioluminescent sort of flame that looks to have similar properties to, say, the Will O Wisp. Other explanations include things such as bioluminescent fungi or insects that might appear like orbs from a distance. But despite these possible answers, there's no clear explanation as to what is creating the Will O Wisp. So could it be science, or could it be ghosts? I think one interesting thing to consider is, despite the rise in things such as photography and video, there hasn't been many good credible evidence of Will O Wisps caught on camera. Now, there could be many reasons for this, but one of the reasons could potentially be the decline of habitat. As we say, the wetlands are what host the Will O Wisp, or the potential chemical reaction that creates the Will O Wisp. And the unfortunate reality is that here in England, 90% of our wetlands have disappeared, particularly here within the last 100 years. And it's quite a depressing reality, because not only have we then lost a potential area of strong folklore here in Britain, but also a significant loss of biodiversity and very real species. In fact, this story is very poignant where I am. We here are in an old port town that once was alongside the sea. However, about 600 years ago, this area set up a company that drained that land and created sea walls to prevent the water from coming back. The reason for this was that, unfortunately, wetlands, despite being extremely important for British biodiversity, were seen as unproductive and unuseful lands that sort of had to be conquered and are now mostly turned into farmland. So unfortunately, with the decline of the habitat for the Will O Wisp, is also the decline of many species that rely on wetlands as well. Anyway, I'd like to hear potential stories from you about the Will O Wisp and to hear about your own experiences. So please let me know and tell me, do you think there is any fact to this folklore? We've obviously talked about the science, but are we just trying to find rational conclusions to something that can't be explained that way?